Okay, as requested by absolutely no one. Oh, geez, I just lost my spot. It's Waterloo. Let me skip to the chase. It's Waterloo. We talked last video about Pickett's charge, Gettysburg, um, the Confederates using Napoleonic tactics with cavalry and such, and uh, how Gettysburg was the end of the Napoleonic charismatic leader kind of strategy. So let's go to Waterloo, 1815. Not all that long ago. It's 2020 now. 100 years ago it was obviously 1920. So this is like 200 years ago. But you figure, in relative time, 1815 ain't all that long ago. Here we go. The battle that marked the end of the road for Napoleon was a classic demonstration of how a more practical commander, such as Wellington, could defeat a charismatic warlord. By understanding the landscape of war brilliantly and using it both to protect and to conceal his troops, Wellington devised a battle-winning formula that finally toppled the greatest commander of them all. In 1812, Napoleon's world had started to collapse with the disintegration of his army during the disastrous retreat from Moscow. Prussia reasserted itself and joined forces with Austria and Russia at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, an encounter that ground him down further. In the Peninsular War in Spain and Portugal from 1808 onwards, the British, commanded by Wellesley, who became the Iron Duke of Wellington as a result, reduced French military power even more. In 1814, the Allies invaded France and occupied Paris. Although he was beaten, Napoleon had demonstrated his old genius by maneuvering brilliantly before his enemies and inflicting several major defeats on them. Forced to abdicate, Napoleon was exiled to the island of Elba, and Louis XVIII was enthroned. The rest of Europe was relieved. The long struggle with revolutionary and then imperial France appeared to be over. How wrong they were. It did not take long for the people of France to forget the horrors that Napoleon had inflicted on the rest of Europe, and they pined for his return. Ex-soldiers recalled only the glory days, and not the disasters of his last campaigns. The economic disarray being felt in France was said to require a strong man to sort it all out, and Napoleon seized his opportunity. Less than a year after his exile to Elba, Napoleon set sail and landed near Cannes. Accompanied by 1,000 of his closest guardsmen, he marched through France towards Paris, gathering support wherever he went. I'm going to try to speak with a French accent as much as possible from here on. The rest of Europe was horrified. As Napoleon entered the capital and resumed control of the French government and its army, the Allied powers met at the Congress of Vienna and declared him an outlaw. By the 1st June, the Allies had raised a formidable array of armies. 95,000 British, Dutch, and German troops, under the command of the Duke of Wellington, had been assembled in Belgium. 124,000 Prussians, under Gebhard von Blücher, marched to join Wellington. 21,000 Germans, the apostrophe's wrong, 21,000 Germans lay along the Rhine frontier. 75,000 Austrians were raised in Italy, and a Russian army of 167,000 slowly advanced westwards. Relying largely on his charisma, the one attribute that never left him, Napoleon managed to raise a force of some 280,000 soldiers. 75,000 of them veterans who needed little urging to join their erstwhile emperor. Faced by such an overwhelming alliance, Napoleon knew that the only way to defeat these armies was to move quickly and to defeat them one by one. It was one of his most brilliant strategies, and he was highly skilled at it. Swiftly he advanced north in order to defeat the Prussians and the British separately before they could join forces. On the 16th of June, Napoleon collided with the Prussians at Ligny. His aggression paid off and the Prussians reeled back. In the meantime, Marshal Ney took on a British vanguard at Quatre Bras, a strategically useful crossroads. Napoleon wanted Ney to help him finish off the Prussians, but the British vanguard proved far tougher to deal with than anticipated, giving Wellington time to gather most of his forces at Waterloo. It had been alleged by the Napoleonic, I don't know how to say that in France, historian Peter Hofschroer, that Wellington deceived the Prussians into making a stand at Ligny, claiming that he would support them, and then not doing so gave himself further time to assemble his troops. If this is true, it could be said to demonstrate the political astuteness of Wellington, indicating the superb grasp of the realities of war that would later help him at Waterloo. Other historians disagree, saying that Wellington pledged support only if he was not attacked, which he was at Quatre Bras. Hofschroer does, however, make a valid point when he emphasizes the fact that Waterloo was a battle in which Germans formed the majority of the Allied forces facing Napoleon. Some 25,000 troops from various German states amounted to more than one-third of the Duke of Wellington's army. That said, it was Wellington who commanded the army that gave Napoleon the most trouble on that day, and it was the toughness of many British regiments which stood their ground that made it such a titanic struggle. Charisma versus good sense. Having pushed the Prussians back to Wavre, I think this is all in France, so I'm trying to... Wavre. On the 18th of June, Napoleon turned his attention to Wellington at Waterloo. Some of the French generals who had fought the British in Spain were rather anxious about the forthcoming encounter, especially Marshal Soult. I think. But Napoleon rounded on him. Because you have been beaten by Wellington, you consider him a good general, but I tell you that Wellington is a bad general and the English are bad troops. The whole affair will not be more serious than swallowing one's breakfast. Okay. Confidence? Wellington did not underestimate his adversary. Employing the practical methods of war he had learned in Spain and India, Wellington analyzed the landscape of battle and placed the majority of his British regiments on the reverse slope of a low plateau running along the Ohain Road, thus screening them from the enemy and protecting them from any opening artillery bombardments. He used the substantial walled farmhouses at Hougoumont, La Haye Sainte, and Papelotte as fortified positions ahead of his flanks and center. Thus breaking up the cohesion of an enemy advance. Above all, Wellington was being cautious and chose a defensive position in the hope of holding the French long enough for Blucher's Prussians to join him, and then together they could overwhelm the French. Disdaining caution and trusting his soldiers' passion for him as their leader, Napoleon took the offensive in his old style. Although his respected abilities as a battlefield surveyor appeared to have deserted him on the day. Opening with a massive artillery barrage that pummeled the Allied lines, Napoleon sent his infantry formations forward at midday, in dense columns, cheering their emperor. Such an advance was usually enough to make any faint-hearted foe dissolve, but the British were unmoved. In addition to this, it had rained heavily the previous night, and the farmland was muddy, making it hard work for the French soldiers to cross the ground and slowing their impetus. Mud also absorbed cannonballs, stopping them from bouncing dangerously across the ground. Despite this, the French captured Papelotte, and by 4 o'clock, the Allied line was pushed back. It was important to keep the pressure on because Napoleon wanted to crush the Allied army before the Prussians arrived. Thus, Ney took it on himself to order a massive French cavalry attack. Napoleon believed that the assault was an hour too early. Standing steady. As the French cavalry thundered towards the Allied lines, the British formed square formations, in which soldiers stood close to their comrades and raised bayonets to the tips of their muskets, so they formed a hedgehog-like defense. Horses do not like charging such obstacles, and their charge faltered. They don't like doing that. Well, no shit. Forgive me. Reducing the French cavalrymen to circling the squares and waving their swords at the British, who returned dense volleys of fire. Formed up behind the ridge of the battlefield, many of these British regiments had also managed to escape the worst of the opening barrage of artillery, although French cannons were carried forward during the battle and used to lay down destructive fire in between the cavalry assaults. The French fired it into us with grape shot, recalls Morris of 73rd Highlanders, which proved very destructive, making complete lanes through us, and then the horsemen came up to dash in the openings. But before they reached us, we had closed our files, throwing the dead outside and taking the wounded inside the square, and they were forced again to retire. They did not, however, go further than the pieces of cannon, waiting there to try the effect of some more grape shot. We saw the match applied, and again it came as thick as hail upon us. It was brutal fighting, made all the worse by the fact that neither side would give way. By 6 o'clock it was clear that Wellington had weathered the storm. His troops had stood firm, and it was the French cavalry that gave way. But danger was still present. As Napoleon concentrated on the approaching Prussians, Ney rallied his men and led another brave assault on the British line. This time, they swept over the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte. Having managed to hold the Prussian advance, Napoleon followed up with one final blow. He would send his most loyal and experienced troops, the Old Guard. Instead of leading them against the weakened Allied center, Ney took the Old Guard beside the Allied right flank, which was covered by the farmhouse of the Hogerman. Behind the farmhouse were batteries of Allied artillery that furiously bombarded the advancing French columns. Fearless under fire, Wellington coolly rode into the front line to support his troops. Coolly now. His presence was highly valued. Wellington came riding up, remembered a 71st Highlander. We formed a square with him in our center to receive cavalry. Shortly, the whole army received orders to advance. We moved forward in 2 columns, 4 deep, the French retiring at the same time. We were charged several times in our advance. This was our last effort. Nothing could impede us. It was gone 8 o'clock. The Allies had refused to be intimidated by the Old Guard, and the Prussians were pushing their own attack elsewhere on the battlefield. Wellington ordered a general advance. Isolated French units fought desperately to the end, but others had had enough and left the battlefield in a mob. Napoleon's time had run out. He had failed to prevent the British and Prussians linking up, and his charisma-based warfare had proved insufficient to defeat a commander like Wellington. 3 days later, Napoleon surrendered to the British and was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic, where he died in 1821. Battle of Waterloo was a tremendous victory, bringing an end to the French Revolutionary period and discouraging the reemergence of any government intent on dominating continental Europe. With Napoleon defeated, military competition from France withered, enabling Britain to prosper and expand its empire around the world. The 19th century would be the British century. So there you go. Horses don't like running into bayonets affixed in at the end of a rifle in a hedgehog-like square defense. Okay. Well, the thing that the horses don't like about doing that is being impaled on the bayonets as it's happening, you see. So they tend not to like that. Now, humans tend not to like grape shot fired out of a cannon. Hold fast, like, they're going to hit us with that grape shot. I just saw the flash again. Oh my God. And then here comes some cavalry. Throw out the dead, bring in the wounded, and get back into formation. The the British had fought in India, and where else? India, let me see here. Oh, no, I'm totally lost. That was good reading. You can leave. You're free to go. It might even cut out on me. I'm not sure. But I like to say things like Napoleon. I like to imitate French people. If I went to France, they'd have to. Well, they'd probably have to stab me because they don't have guns. I don't think, but they'd hit me with something. Napoleon. Napoleon. Yep. I can't remember. I can't find it either. All I can find is grape shot. Grape shot. With the Prussians. I'm gonna find it. I'll read the whole thing again. I don't care. I don't know. India and somewhere else. I can't find it. Thanks for watching.